This is the fourth of our Charm Database seminars today. And today I'm going to focus on a part of the NIH application. It's very important, called the significance section. I'll explain where that fits in a moment. And then we'll have a little opportunity for to have an example. Vanessa Wandry, who's just defended her master's thesis on breastfeeding with us, will tell us about her work. And this is one of the earliest papers to make full use of all of the March data. So it will be very useful for many of you to pay attention to what she found and how you can participate in research on breastfeeding or in other matters. So this is, we'll take a summer break, and our next session will be in September. It'll be on Monday, September the 9th, and the topic will be on the sampling frame for March, because remember, we tried to establish a population-based sample using a stratified random sample of hospitals and then clinics in the Lower Peninsula. And Michael Elliott, the brains behind that, will come and talk to us. He's our principal investigator at the University of Michigan of this study, and I'm sure that'll be a fascinating conversation. Now, one thing, I'll interrupt myself by telling you that there, in 2 days from now, there's an NIH webinar just got announced on walking through the NIH grants process, Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And as they say, it will help you learn about how to apply to NIH, how to write applications. And below you see there's the web link, but I'm sure you could find it if you put in the title or something into a search engine. And I just wish this wouldn't happen. Oh, there we go. I have to leave this untouched. My mouse just flies around everywhere. So all investigator-initiated applications to NIH, be they training grants, research grants, fellowship grants, student grants, all have the same 5 criteria for evaluation. And eventually I'll go through each one of them in the seminars. These 5 were set up, I'm going to say about 15 or 20 years ago. Before that, they didn't have categories. Reviewers were on their own to decide how to weigh the components of an application. But this has been in the books now for a long time. However, as I'll show you, just this year, there's been a slight modification to this in the way that, not to this structure, but in fact to the way this structure is weighted or evaluated by reviewers. So until this year, each of these 5 categories was scored 1 through 9, with 1 being the best, and 9, you should never have a 9 on any applications, heaven forbid.
Yeah.
And they're hardly ever given, you know. A really low score is about a 7, you know. And then the reviewer is supposed to give it the total score, which need not be an average of those 5 scores he gave, or he or she gave, because you may say that the whole is more than or perhaps less than its parts. Now, here's the new wrinkle. Since 2024, and this has only just come out like a few months ago, there's a simplified framework for peer review. Now, I can't say how this works in practice because it's not been used in practice yet. This is the future. Now, this time, only 3 factors of these 5 factors, they've combined things so that only 3 things are scored. And in fact, only 2 really get a score. 1 gets a yes, no. So they've decided to score factor 1, which they call the importance of research. And that includes the 2 categories of significance and innovation. Significance is the one I'll talk about this time. Probably next time I talk in October, we'll talk about innovation, which is closely related to this. And then factor 2 is rigor and feasibility, which is really what used to be called, which is the approach section, basically. How are you actually going to do it? Are you doing it well? And can it be done? And factor 3, what used to be called investigator environment, are put together under expertise and resources And these are given a kind of a yes, no. Either it's appropriate, yes, you have all the people you need, or it's inappropriate, you need more. And obviously that could range.
All the appointments are made after lunch.
Someone's talking on someone needs to be muted. Jennifer, can you mute? Thank you. So, but importantly, the reviewer can't just say, I don't think they're good enough. The reviewer has to give the specific problems that he or she sees in the expertise or resources needed to carry out the project. So this is a really interesting new wrinkle. We'll see how it plays out. NIH explains it by saying it serves to focus reviews on three central questions: how important, how rigorous and feasible, and do you have the expertise and resources necessary? Now, in my opinion, what this does, this change elevates significance and innovation a bit. They're not put on a par with the approach. Previously, I think approach really dominated the weights given to total scores. So it puts significance. Innovation is really about ideas, and I think approach is really about execution of the ideas. So I think the ideas now have been given a little more prominence, and also by downgrading investigator environment into a simple yes/no option and requiring specific comments, I think it helps young investigators because there's less ability of a senior figure to get a lot of credit for being really good at this. All they get for that is actually a yes. But you could get yes as a junior investigator if you have a good team and you seem to know what you're doing. So I think this is kind of, in my mind, a little bit helpful to young investigators. Although we'll have to see how it plays out with the reviewers. So let's turn to significance. It's, as you see, part of factor one. It's half of it, or maybe more than half, who knows, in the minds of, and it really sets it sets the stage for your research. It's the background really to your research. And here's the wording that NIH used in 2022, the most recent I could find. You have to explain the importance of the problem or the critical barrier to progress that the proposed research addresses. Then you should describe the strengths and weaknesses and the rigor. And I'll come back to the term rigor, which is a new term being used, tossed around in NIH reviews, of the prior research. How good is it? How strong is it? And then explain how what you're going to do is going to make an improvement. And then finally, how even to go further, how even the field will be changed by what you are proposing. Very ambitious description of significance. NINDS, which is one of the agencies that happened to find their own kind of narrative around significance, they point out that really significance comes up everywhere in the application, really pretty much. But the significant sections give you the most details. And they make this very nice point. The farther removed your reviewers are from your field, the more information you need to provide on maybe basic biology, importance of the area, research opportunities, new findings. This is this point about removed from your field is a very important thing to keep in mind whenever you do any applications. Assume, it's much, much better to assume that the reviewer knows little than the reviewer knows a lot. Much better to err on the side of giving too much information than saying, oh, this is too obvious. Everybody knows this already. Let them say that. You'd be surprised. You would be, surprised, shocked at the ignorance of reviewers sometimes. And they point out, this is really helpful, review the potentially relevant study section rosters. You can go on NIH website and you can see which study section is likely to review a grant. You can see the membership. I mean, it may get changed a little bit between the time you see it and the time your grant is actually reviewed. And you can even do searches on the bibliography of these people and kind of see, it's very useful, especially if you say, there's a really key paper in my field, but I don't want to cite it. And then you discover the person who wrote it is on your study section. Go back, cite it. Be sensible. And this definition of significance also talks about the word rigor and transparency, which I'll parse through in a little bit. So essentially, what this all leads up to is that I'm sorry. Before I say that, I'll just take a little bit of moment to talk about rigor because it comes up. It's really a relatively recently used term in NIH, but it's become rather important. They want you to comment on how rigorous not only your own research is, but also the research that you're citing. And they have a 2-page uh, uh, document which I can send to you, or we can put on the we'll put on the CHOM website. But it's also you can I'll give you the link in a moment. That goes into some detail what they mean exactly by rigor, and basically it's really the scientific quality. And transparency actually means that your own research and the research you're drawing upon looks appropriately at different components of the population: men, women, children, adults, and so forth. So the full two-page document is here. You can take that. Maybe it might be if you know what, Kylie, if you can copy that and put that in the chat, then people could perhaps more easily copy it if they want to. But you can just look it up under rigor and transparency and NIH applications. You'll come across it, and we'll put it up on the website too. But fundamentally, it's as I said, it's 2019 that they began to use this term rigor and transparency, and these qualities apply both to your own research in the approach section and also to the background sections that you provide in significance. The rigor and transparency of the prior research is insignificant, so you have to keep that in mind. Make sure what you're citing is rigorous, scientifically valid. They talk about the details of that in the 2-page document. And also transparent. The term transparent means basically taking account of sex and other biological variables. It's a little fuzzy, to be perfectly honest. It's not entirely clear, but I think what they're trying to avoid is, studies of heart disease that are only taking place in men. Nobody thinks about women or some things of that ilk. So they want you to take account of these things as you review your literature and as you also write your research project. If you work with a specific group of people of one ethnicity, of one gender, of one age group, you will have to justify doing that, so consider those factors under the term of transparency. And here's some more of the NIH language on rigor. Consider whether the prior research is rigorous. Is it really good, solid stuff? Consider whether the investigators, this is now part of the approach, consider whether you have plans to address weaknesses and gaps identified in rigor. In other words, if you find that samples up to now were rather small, multivariate analysis wasn't performed well, what we need is a randomized trial, et cetera, you should say this. You're going to replace the lack of rigor with your new, more rigorous approach. And the point is actually very general. The weaknesses in rigor of the prior research is that is really the core of what you should be doing. In other words, as I've said before, when I talked about how you develop a scientific niche, what your study should be is a response to the literature. It's the reason we're doing this is because of what hasn't been done yet, how we can move the ball forward. So although it used to be, back when I started, and I started a very long time ago in this business, there used to be a section called background. You used to actually be expected to do a literature review. That was abolished when they moved to significance. And then people scratched their heads and said, where do I put my literature review? Surely they want a literature review. And the answer is mostly in significance, because significance it's the world that you've done scholarship on that tells you whether this is important, the vital data you look at, the studies you've looked at. And so I think when you think of significance, think of your getting a handle on the literature. And I like to use a term that I've used in teaching called the targeted review. Let me explain what I mean by it. What do I mean by a targeted review? Literature review just is summarizing information, but a targeted literature review summarizes information to make a point. And the point is to show that your research is needed. So when you're writing the literature review, you're not writing it just to say, Dr. Jones found this and Dr. Smith found this. You're trying to say, to make an argument, making a case for your research because of what has been done before or because of what hasn't been done before. What's missing? Where do you fill? What need do you fill? And of course, this implies that you really do have to be, as I've said in many audiences, you really have to be cognizant of the prior literature. You really have to soak up what's been done in the area you're working on, know it well, not just because some reviewer might know something that you don't know, but just because in order to really make the best research project, every research project is in the context of prior research. It doesn't come out of the blue. And yours has to be contextualized, give it a reason for being by what you say about the prior research. And I think there are several specific goals of a targeted literature review. I think, first of all, public health, you have to convince the reviewers that what you're addressing is important. It's not trivial. It's not a minor thing. It's of importance. Now, obviously, some topics are bigger than others, but you would have to make the case that there's a real burden here that you are addressing. The second thing is if possible, please try to identify a key scientific issue, not just a health issue, but a science issue. Some improvement in the science, some way of doing it that hasn't been done before, some new aspect of things. And I would say I wouldn't underestimate knowledge. When I review applications, it's very quickly apparent, usually in the significant section, but also in the approach, you learn very quickly whether the authors are really knowledgeable or they have a kind of superficial knowledge. So when you write these sections, you're really also trying to explain to the review committee, hey, I know my stuff. We do really know what we're talking about here. And sometimes that comes from having published a lot, but sometimes it comes just from using good thoughts, thinking well about the prior literature and making appropriate critiques of it. And of course, when you come to the approach section, which is not really quite part of that, but you will have to convince the reviewer that you have a solution to the problems you've identified. And finally, the final step really is that your significance should kind of end up on almost like, well, when I've read all this literature, what really is needed to be done is just what I'm doing, just what I'm going to tell you I'm going to do. That's, you are the next key advance in the field. Now, admittedly, these are all ideals, but you have to try to approximate those ideals to make to get a good score from the reviewers. It's, as I say, the review should be thoroughly grounded in literature, and you know exactly what others have done, and also you are able to distinguish yourself from what's been done before and show how what you're doing now is moving things forward. It doesn't have to always be a critique of the prior literature. You can say, well, they've gone this far. Now the next step is, and so on. And the better you know the literature, the more convincing you can be. And this is why I've used this term. I used it in the first seminar, a research niche. You should identify a research. This is where I'm working. This is the stuff I'm doing. This is what I'm good at and getting better at. This is what my team wants to do. Now, here's some literature review no-nos. Don't just list one study after another. I mean, you see this in review. Somebody's going to say, I'm going to inventory everything that's ever been done in the world on this topic. Well, first of all, you can't do that. But it's so you don't want to bore the reviewer. Please never bore the reviewer. Never make them bored. Not a good idea. They're very susceptible to becoming bored. If you've been on the study section, you know what I'm talking about when you have all these studies you're reading. And also, don't elaborately describe the methodology of the study unless you're making a point about it. You don't have to say, Jones assembled 10,000 people and he measured such and such and such and such, and he followed them for 12 years, and then he measured such and such and such and such, unless some part of those measurements and that sample size has to do with your research. So your literature review is you extract the points you want to make. When you cite a paper, it's cited for a purpose. Okay. And think of it really in scientific terms. Don't try to impress the reviewers. Don't say, this sounds impressive. No, don't think of it that way. Think of it as the reviewer will get that I'm really thoughtful and knowledgeable, And again, one is tempted, if you talk about rigor, to tear apart studies X, Y, and Z and show why they're all wrong. But just remember, you could have someone on the panel who you're criticizing. So be very cautious in your wording as you critique studies. Even though they want you to emphasize the rigor, you can always say, well, the sample size could have been larger, or there are ways of nicely criticizing. Useful in life too. Now, how to review the literature. Just keep in mind that, again, every citation is for a purpose, which is to advance your argument. You're not just saying it to say, and there was a paper here. It has to advance your argument. And make sure then that the reason you're saying this is very clear to the reviewer. They know why you're using this paper. And I would say that in general, if a citation isn't useful to reinforce where you're going, omit it. Now, this gets tricky sometimes because sometimes a very well-known paper and you don't think it's really all that relevant, then at least say, we are aware of the work of such and such, but we don't think it applies here. Or you could say whatever you need to say about it, but be very important to emphasize the background that's relevant to what you're doing. And this is very important to be concise. It's very easy to run on and on and on about papers. And when I've taught about how to write, it's always, you don't have to say, in a paper published in 1967, Johnson, Smith, and colleagues working at the Mayo Clinic found. You could just say, Johnson et al. Found, or it was found. You don't have to elaborate unless there's a reason to elaborate. Again, every part of the review you do is targeted to the success of your proposal. Also, this is important. Don't limit yourself to new citations. A paper was submitted to me to review by one of the journals. It was on a topic that I had written on a long time ago, and many people have written on. And the authors said, not much has been written on this subject. The first I saw the title and the first words of the abstract, I said, wait a minute here. Then I looked at their citations, and there was not a single citation to literature older than 2010. Not a good idea. A lot of old folks like me out there. Not a good idea. The world was not created in 2010. Lots of good stuff was done in the past. So go back. And by the way, Index Medicus is a serious problem. It does not do, it hardly picks up a paper prior to 1950. And even in the 50s, it's pretty thin. And then sometimes there's some very, very important work that was done before that. I can assure you that it was really, even though I wasn't doing it, I may look old, but I wasn't publishing before 1950. So sometimes you have to use Google Scholar to retrieve older literature. That's one good way, or even go to the library, because unfortunately, Index Medicus is so interested in getting the current literature online that it's not done a good job of getting the older literature online. And you may find some gems that are highly relevant to your work in older literature. Of course, you don't want to be outdated either. You don't want to. You want to make sure that you really are up to date and have found the latest paper. One, by the way, a very useful thing to do, I use it a lot, is if you find a paper from the past that you thought was really great, and you wonder whether anybody's done anything like that since, use the citation index in the library. Go Science Citation Index, and you can see who has cited this paper. You can put in that paper and they'll tell you who has cited it since, and then you can pick up more easily perhaps than just by searching in using titles, anything written recently that makes use of that key paper. Also be rather careful to read the papers and cite them very carefully. If you miscite a paper, and believe me, it is so easy to do that. First of all, because if you take a reference from some other paper, you would be amazed how many reference errors there are in papers. And again, to reinforce a point I said earlier, instead of just simply criticizing, even though you're looking at rigor, you can point out how your study will advance the science over what's been published. Then the rigor becomes clear. And when you resubmit, and unfortunately, let's be honest, most of us have to resubmit. Not many of us get funded on the first cycle. Be sure to update the literature. People notice. If you had a review on the second cycle, who noticed, who saw the first cycle, and they know that the literature review, and they can say, they didn't change anything. Look up anything new since in the last 6 or 9 months since they resubmitted previously. So try to be up to date on your literature review at all times. Tables and figures are very helpful in summarizing literature. You save a lot of space because you can put a lot of information in a table and then refer briefly to the papers. Another principle that I like to emphasize a lot is that you always get two things in statistical analysis: a measure of association and a p-value. And the p-value is less important than the measure of association. What you want to know, it multiplied the risk 5 times, not just whether it's p less than 0.05. So keep that in mind. And figures are very good for looking at rather sharp things, sharp changes. Don't use the figure to show a teeny change. That's a waste of figures. If you have something really dramatic, a big difference, something you can make a lot out of, then use a figure. But don't use a figure to just have a figure. Change should be very easy to do. And by the way, in the construction of tables and figures, we can talk about that as a separate topic. There are ways to convey information well and ways to convey information badly, especially in it is not trivial when you're pulling up figures and tables to think of font size. It is not at all trivial. You want to have that illustration, whatever it be, a table or a figure, be very clear, crystal clear to the reviewer, easily absorbable, and certainly visible. I have seen grant proposals that want to pack so much information in a figure you just can't see what's going on. And that's not the reviewers don't seem to like. It didn't make me happy when I was reviewing. I saw that kind of stuff. Probably doesn't make anybody happy. Organizations. I think it's very good to have a bullet point system. You don't have to, but it's one way to do it, in which you're making a point, and these 3 references support that point, and then another point, and these 5 references support this point. Perhaps you summarize them in a table. And very good to end on a summary paragraph of your significant section that says, okay, so after reviewing all this, what this obviously leads to, the next step is basically what you're going to read in the next section, which is approach. So I think what I've seen in problems in literature reviews that are part of significance is not really thinking about your audience. You really should not assume that a study section is expert in all parts of your research proposal. In fact, it's extremely unlikely that study section, all members of study section, remember, every single person votes. And every single person, now, it is true that usually there are 1 or 2 or 3 key reviewers who are usually selected because of their expertise. But the study section panel can be up to 20 people, and they listen to the arguments. They may or may not read in depth. It's supposed to read them all, but they may not all read in depth. But they all get to vote. So what you really have to do is to make sure that everybody in study section gets it. And this means that you're not writing for the expert, you're writing for kind of a semi-expert. So risk, as I said before, risk over-explaining rather than under-explaining. You have to have a logical framework. Everything has to fit into a scheme of things. That may sound like an obvious thing to say, but again, I'm speaking from experience reading grant applications, in which people somehow don't quite follow a logical chain of reasoning. Depth of knowledge. You really want the reviewer who reads your significance section should be saying, this person really knows the literature, really does, you know, and because otherwise they may just dismiss you as someone who's superficial. Also, sometimes you have to be thinking again of this targeted review. The literature review has to link to what you're doing. It should not be independent. Significance and approach cannot be independent items. They must synchronize with each other. So your significance is leading to what you're going to say in the approach. And somehow, you know, you have to also get to this point that you are trying to resolve a problem that hasn't been resolved yet. So therefore, you need, after your research wouldn't be needed if we knew the answer. Research is all about finding answers that weren't there before. So so be sure to make sure that your study resolves problems in literature and advances the field. I wonder if this is my last slide. Yes, it is. Okay, so let me put them. I'll keep the screen on just to ask if anybody has a question about right now. Before we get to Vanessa, let me just ask if anybody has any question or issue they want to bring up. And I can't always see all of your, let me just try to get it so I can see everybody if they put up their hands. I don't want to do that. Unfortunately, my screen isn't telling me. So maybe you just have to shout out if you want to ask a question. No questions as yet? Okay. All right, so maybe we'll turn to Vanessa. Vanessa, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, so I will stop sharing my screen. Get this darn thing to work. And you can take it over and start sharing. Oh, I see some things in the chat. Let me just quickly look at the chat. See if there's anything I can, oops, where did my chat go? Sorry, I'll just take a second, Vanessa, before you begin to look at the chat, which I wasn't able to see before. Kylie has put in that link to the event on Wednesday. Will the presentation? Yes, Dr. Medina, it's this presentation and even the tape is going to be on the Charm MSU website, where the other 3 presentations already are present, so you can go right through all of them. And Jean is just the recording. Okay, I think that's, let me see if there's anything more. Oh, you said so. That's right, you've answered already. Jean, thank you. Oh, Reina, thank you, Reina. Oh, glad you enjoyed it, Reina.
After 30 years of being PI, I should say that I was taking rigorous notes. I'm still learning from you. You are the best.
You're a sweet, Reina. This is
believe
wonderful.
every word that is coming from your mouth because it is all so true.
You're very, very kind, Reina. Reina Ficharova is our colleague at Harvard at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, particularly involved in ECHO and involved in a miscarriage project with Ali Glazier and Kylie Bisania and several others on this call. So thank you very much for these kind words, Reina. And now we'll turn to Vanessa. Vanessa Wandry just recently defended her master's thesis. She's a student of Drs. Comstock, Ana Vasquez, and Jean Curver. And the title is there. And take it away, Vanessa.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to share my master's thesis work with you all. It is entitled Associations Between Maternal Pre-Pregnancy Body Mass Index and Exclusive Human Milk Pumping in a Michigan Cohort. And before I get started, I would like to thank my committee members for helping me with this project, Dr. Comstock, Dr. Vasquez, and Dr. Kerber. So just a quick look at the aims of the study. We examined the question, is maternal pre-pregnancy BMI associated with exclusive human milk pumping? We used data from the March pregnancy cohort. The first aim was to describe characteristics of cohort participants who exclusively pump and the second aim was to assess the associations between maternal prepregnancy BMI and exclusive human milk pumping, with the hypothesis that those who had higher BMIs would be more likely to exclusively pump. So the following will just give a little background. So human milk is the recommended food source for infants to consume for at least the first 6 months, as it provides nutrients for growth and development for the baby. Human milk also gives protection from diseases for both infants and mothers and offers a cost-effective solution, as families adhering to ideal breastfeeding practices can save $1,200 to $1,500 by foregoing formula purchases in the first year of their infant's life. Recent U.S. data show that 87% of parent-infant dyads initiate human milk feeding. This is an increase in initiation compared to previous years. For 1999 to 2000, initiation was 68%. Even with these recommendations, however, few infants get fed for the recommended duration periods. For instance, the CDC reported that for babies born in 2020, breastfeeding rates decreased from 83% initiation to 58% at 6 months and 37% at 1 year. There are certain socioeconomic factors that can have an impact on whether the mother initiates breastfeeding and for how long, no matter how much they want to be able to breastfeed. These factors can be things such as exhaustion, lack of support from friends, family, or loved ones, peer and family perspectives on feeding, hospitals lacking in expertise or education services, social media, and community acceptance, as some cultures or groups may not accept breastfeeding practices. Other challenges that can prevent or shorten breastfeeding for an individual may be lack of experience, absence of accommodations in the workplace, societal expectations or their own beliefs have been noted as pressures for some women. This pressure can in turn create poor breastfeeding outcomes and can leave the mother with a negative overall breastfeeding experience. Some people believe that breastfeeding causes a feminist problem due to its public perception of being sex-specific. They feel it should not just be the woman's job to feed and take care of the baby, and that other people in the household need to take on these responsibilities as well. With this perception, some women feel that they are constrained by breastfeeding responsibilities and perceive it as a hindrance. So in turn, turning to bottle feeding is freeing for them. Additionally, certain health conditions for the mother may not allow for breastfeeding. For example, for those with mental illnesses, psychiatrists recommend not to breastfeed, as it can do more harm than good by putting these individuals more at risk for reoccurrences of their mental illness due to sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation can cause mental illness events to occur, which could include, but is not limited to, depression, suicidal thoughts, mania, anxiety, and substance abuse. Rates for adults and children being overweight and obese continue to increase. Increased BMI has been linked to a decrease in breastfeeding initiation and duration compared to those who are not obese. In one study done in Belgium, looking at the effects pre-pregnancy BMI has on breastfeeding, authors found that the rate of intention and initiation was notably lower among those who were underweight and obese compared to those who were normal weight and overweight. They also looked at potential reasons for cessation of breastfeeding for obese women, which included maternal complications, insufficient milk supply, sucking problems, and work resumption. Besides breastfeeding, there are other methods of infant feeding. These can include ways such as expressing milk or pumping, combination feeding, and infant formula. The expression of milk is equivalent to pumping, as pumping milk is a branch of expressing milk. Some women may feed their child exclusively pumped milk and never feed at the breast. This group we will refer to as exclusive pumpers. Another option is exclusive breastfeeding, where mothers only feed their baby at the breast. We will call this the breastfeeding only group. Others may use a combination of feeding methods and feed pumped milk as well as at the breast. We will refer to this group as the breast plus or minus pump group. Meanwhile, some may use infant formula feeding. There is little research on the relatively new phenomenon of exclusive pumping. However, literature does suggest that some potential reasons to choose to exclusively pump include history of sexual abuse, societal pressures to breastfeed causing women to pump instead, emotional distress, latching issues, convenience of another person being able to feed the baby, heartbreak, as some mothers really want to be able to feed human milk to their baby but have troubles breastfeeding, or medical conditions for the mom or baby that prevent breastfeeding. From these potential reasons, history of sexual abuse is a common reason of exclusive pumping due to the sensual feelings that occur during breastfeeding, as they can pose challenges for sexual abuse survivors, especially in regards to breastfeeding or initiation, as it can trigger memories that are linked to the sensation. This causes the survivor to experience increased psychological distress, depression, PTSD, and social isolation. Literature discussing women who were sexual abuse survivors' feelings on breastfeeding include feelings of disgust that they forced their baby to suck on their nipples. Others, when thinking of the feeling, reported that they just can't stand it. To avoid these feelings, many survivors consider alternative methods of feeding. Not very many people know of exclusive pumping as a method of feeding, and many health professionals do not mention it as an option for expecting mothers. Oftentimes, mothers seek guidance from social media platforms instead. So for our study, we used data from the March pregnancy cohort. We used one survey in pregnancy done at the first prenatal visit, where self-reported maternal height and pre-pregnancy weight were obtained. If there was missing data from these, we then used the birth certificate data, and then we calculated the BMIs. We also used data from the 3-month postpartum survey, and this is where we could evaluate the exclusive pumping status as to whether they were an exclusive pumper or not. The questions are shown in Table 2 for deriving these groups, while Figure 1 shows this derivation and respective sample sizes. There were 651 individuals who initiated human milk. To make the feeding groups, we used the data from the questions, was baby ever breastfed directly at the breast, and did baby ever drink express breast milk? Using these, we then broke groups down into those who exclusively pumped or fed only pumped milk, with a sample size of 31, the breast plus or minus pump group, which included those who used both pumping and breastfeeding to feed their baby and had a sample size of 545, and those who only fed their baby at the breast and did not feed pump milk with a sample size of 75. Covariates were selected based on previous literature. The following were chosen: gestational age at delivery, mother's marital status, household income, mother's education level, mother's cigarette smoking status, maternal race, mother's WIC status in the last month, mother's job status, and mother's age. So for results, Figure 2 shows the survival analysis I made using a Kaplan-Meier curve with 95% confidence intervals. Feeding durations represented in days on the x-axis depict the survival probability as participants stopped feeding their baby via the specific method of feeding. The blue line represents the pump-only group, the red is the breastfeeding-only group, and the green is the breast plus or minus pump group. The breast plus or minus pump group had the longest duration of feeding for any method. Initially, more people in the pump-only group sustained feeding for a longer duration compared to the breastfeeding-only group, and both of these groups had a minimal number of people still feeding for these respective methods at the 90-day mark, whereas the breast plus or minus pump group had more people sustaining longer durations, with about 40% of people still feeding at the 90-day mark, showing more people in the sample opting for using a combination of methods for feeding and for a longer duration. Among those who initiated human milk, about 5% were identified as exclusive pumpers. Those who exclusively pumped were more likely to have an education below a bachelor's, be unmarried, obese, and receive WIC in the past month, and have an annual household income less than $25,000 compared to those who are not obese, or not exclusive pumpers, sorry. In the unadjusted model, there was a weak, non-significant association between obesity and a higher odds of exclusive pumping, with an odds ratio of 1.8 compared to those using other human milk feeding methods. Covariates were added to the model, but remained non-significant. However, in a post hoc subgroup analysis, with the reference group consisting of those who were normal weight and overweight, while also excluding those who were considered underweight, the test resulted in significant findings with an odds ratio of 3.8 and a 95% confidence interval of 1.07 to 13.3. We found similar findings to the existing literature in regards to characteristics among exclusive pumpers, as exclusive pumpers tended to have an education below a bachelor's, be white in terms of race, have lower annual household income, and receive WIC. Our findings revealed a weak, non-significant association between exclusive pumping and a higher chance of being obese. This remained non-significant across all models, even with different covariates added. However, there was a significant association when the reference group was changed to normal and overweight individuals while also excluding those who were considered underweight. Obese women may opt for exclusive pumping due to a lack of confidence in their body type, which may lead to discomfort with breastfeeding in public. Large breasts, which are common among obese women, may pose challenges for infant latching, potentially causing them to opt for exclusive pumping. Overweight women in our study were less likely than obese women to exclusively pump, which could suggest that they may face fewer physical or emotional barriers than obese women. Some strengths of our study would be the use of a Michigan population-based sample. We were not able to use the sampling weights for this research. However, if I publish, I would use them, and that would help enhance the generalizability of the findings to the broader population in Michigan. This project did not come without some limitations, one of these being the lack of available weight data to accommodate the complex survey design. Another is the sample size, particularly in the exclusive pumping group with a sample size of 31, which warrants consideration for replication in larger studies to enhance statistical power and reliability. Also, data collection relied on self-reporting for feeding methods, duration, weight, and height, which could lead to some measures being under or overestimated depending on timeframes and social desirability. We also did not account for factors such as NICU stay, food stamp use, and feeding duration in the analyses, which could have provided valuable insights into the dynamics of exclusive pumping, and we did not specifically address infant formula feeding. To conclude, in this Michigan sample, those who exclusively pumped were more likely to have an education below a bachelor's, be unmarried, obese, receive WIC, and have an annual income less than $25,000. In the unadjusted model, there was a weak, non-significant association between obesity and a higher odds of exclusive pumping compared to those using other human milk feeding methods. Despite a shorter duration, exclusive pumping could serve as an initial approach for providing human milk to a baby with the possibility of transitioning to alternative feeding methods later on. For individuals lacking confidence, with a history of sexual abuse, with health conditions obstructing feeding, or those with concerns about their body type impeding breastfeeding, exclusive pumping may emerge as a viable option. Thank you.
And thank you, Vanessa, for a really interesting presentation. I think what this presentation shows is that you can, I mean, among other things, is you can take a relatively uncommon behavior like exclusive pumping, which is not very common. When you have a good sized sample, you can begin to study it and to compare it to other forms of infant feeding. And it does also signal that we do have rather detailed information on breastfeeding practices, to some extent durations, and of course, as you know, these can all be correlated with many, many other components of our research efforts and our data, including if you're interested in nutritional information, chemical information, so forth. So does anyone have any questions for Vanessa specifically? I'm hoping again that you're energized a little bit to say, well, even if I'm not interested in this particular topic, I can see where I can go with March, the directions I could take. Okay.
Dr. Bennett?
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
Good morning, everybody.
Hi, Shatoya. How are you?
Hi. I promise I always have mute problems. This is a brand new cell phone and I still have mute problems. But hi, Vanessa. I wanted to say that your topic reminds me, it just reminds me of what I was hearing when I was recruiting for Charm back in the early days, 2017, 2018. And moms would say that they felt like a failure because they didn't think they would be able to breastfeed with this child because they didn't do well with their previous child. And the other thing that I wanted to say is your presentation was so beautiful because I love your pauses. I don't know why that stuck out to me, but you made it very easy to understand and relate to.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I definitely worked hard on it. as it was my master's thesis, but thank you very much. And yeah, definitely, past experiences can have a big impact on what people do in the future. So it is really interesting to see how, moms go with their future children, how they feed them and all that. So thank you.
Very nice comments, Latoya. Thanks very much. Any other thoughts, anyone? Or about anything, any thoughts about what I spoke of, literature reviews, significant section, NIH review procedures? All right then. So until the fall, have a great summer, everyone. Thanks for attending. I appreciate the really solid attendance we've had at these seminars, always at least 30 people. And we'll keep trying to give you useful information in the fall. Okay. Take care.
Okay.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thank
Nigel.
you.
Thank you.